Disappointed that I came to Canada, a Canada that it is very, very difficult to find Canadians who are passionate about the American-Canadian relationship.
It's disappointing how we feel we've been treated.
What is he on the rock or something? Like, does he know what's going on?
I would suggest that he gets a mirror and looks in it, because the issues that are between the US and Canada are caused by the US.
We ran a campaign where, it was anti-American, elbows up, me too. It was an anti-American campaign. That has continued.
When U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra stood before reporters and delivered remarks that dismissed Canadian concerns as overblown and misguided, few in Washington expected the fury that would follow north of the border. But in Canada, the reaction was instantaneous, visceral, and unrelenting, and within hours headlines screamed of insult and betrayal. Talk shows lit up with indignation, and across social media, Canadians voiced a collective outrage that transcended politics, language, and region, uniting the country in a wave of fury not seen in decades. What might have been brushed aside as a diplomatic misstep in calmer times became, under the weight of strained US-Canada relations, a spark that ignited a nationwide firestorm. Hoekstra, long seen as a blunt envoy with little patience for nuance, had underestimated not just the sensitivity of Canadians, but the pride they took in defending their sovereignty and values. And into this storm stepped Mark Carney, the respected former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man whose gravitas and credibility made him uniquely suited to speak when politicians hesitated. Carney, measured but firm, dissected Hoekstra's remarks in a televised interview that quickly went viral, exposing what he called a dangerous arrogance in the ambassador's tone, and highlighting the broader risks of a U.S. administration that treated allies with contempt while demanding loyalty. His words resonated deeply, not just with Canadians, but with audiences across the United States who had grown weary of diplomatic blunders that weakened alliances instead of strengthening them. In cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, protests erupted outside U.S. consulates, not violent, but loud and symbolic, with demonstrators waving Canadian flags and holding signs that read, "Respect our nation," and "We stand with Carney." Canadian politicians, initially cautious, soon found themselves swept up in the tide of public anger, and even those who had sought to maintain close ties with Washington could not ignore the groundswell of outrage. Prime ministerial statements spoke of deep disappointment and serious concern, while opposition leaders accused the government of being too soft, demanding Hoekstra's recall. The episode revealed more than just a diplomatic rift. It exposed the fragility of a relationship long described as the closest between two nations on Earth. Trade, security, cultural exchange, all seemed suddenly at risk, as ordinary Canadians questioned whether their neighbor to the south could still be trusted as a partner. Meanwhile, inside the U.S., Hoekstra's words became fodder for partisan debate. Supporters praised his bluntness as refreshing honesty, while critics called it reckless, an avoidable insult to an ally at a time when America could least afford to alienate friends. Cable networks replayed Carney's rebuke in endless loops, analysts praising his calm authority compared to the ambassador's bombast. In small towns across the Midwest and Great Lakes region, communities that relied on cross-border trade began to worry. Truckers moving goods through Detroit-Windsor crossings feared delays as tensions grew. Farmers who exported beef, pork, and grain to Canada watched anxiously, wondering if anger would translate into new restrictions. Auto workers, whose industry depended on seamless supply chains stretching from Ontario to Michigan, saw their futures threatened by a diplomatic row born not of policy, but of pride. And through it all, Trump fumed privately, furious that an ambassador's words had sparked yet another international controversy, but unwilling to admit error publicly, preferring instead to frame Canada's outrage as overreaction. The damage, however, was real, and it deepened each day as Canadian media, normally cautious in covering U.S. affairs, devoted front pages and hours of broadcast time to dissecting every nuance of Hoekstra's remarks and Carney's devastating takedown. What emerged was not merely a scandal, but a reckoning, a moment when Canadians confronted the reality that their allies' words and actions no longer aligned with the partnership they had once trusted implicitly, and for Americans watching from afar, it was a sobering glimpse of how quickly arrogance could unravel decades of goodwill. The fury in Canada only intensified as commentators began to frame Hoekstra's remarks as not just a diplomatic slight, but a symbol of a deeper disregard by Washington toward its northern neighbor, a disregard that seemed to confirm fears that under Trump's leadership, alliances were transactional, fragile, and expendable. And this framing took root quickly because Carney's intervention provided the intellectual backbone for what millions of Canadians felt instinctively, that respect was non-negotiable, and that sovereignty could not be belittled without consequence. His analysis, clipped and replayed countless times, argued that Hoekstra had revealed a mindset that treated Canada as a junior partner rather than an equal, and that such a mindset could corrode the trust necessary to sustain not just trade, but security cooperation, environmental agreements, and cultural exchange. In Ottawa, Parliament convened emergency debates, members rising one after another to denounce the remarks. And in an unusual show of unity, government ministers and opposition MPs alike found common cause in demanding accountability. Editorial boards from coast to coast called for Hoekstra's resignation, noting that an ambassador who alienated the public so deeply could no longer credibly represent the United States. And Carney's voice became the touchstone for those arguments, his credibility as a statesman lending weight to demands that otherwise might have been dismissed as political theater. Across the border in the United States, however, the reaction was more fragmented. Conservative outlets downplayed the controversy, framing Canadian outrage as hypersensitivity and praising Hoekstra for telling it like it is. But mainstream networks leaned into the drama, recognizing that Carney's calm rebuke struck a chord not only with Canadians but with Americans disillusioned by Trump-era diplomacy. Town halls in Michigan and Minnesota, states whose economies were tightly bound to Canada, revealed deep unease. Farmers, manufacturers, and union leaders voiced frustration that petty remarks could jeopardize billions in trade and tens of thousands of jobs. Truckers interviewed at border crossings spoke of heightened tensions in conversations with Canadian customs officers, who, while professional, were clearly unsettled by the diplomatic chill. The specter of retaliatory measures loomed, with Canadian officials hinting at reviews of American agricultural imports, steel contracts, and energy agreements. And these hints rattled markets, sending ripples through the stock prices of companies dependent on smooth bilateral trade. Inside the Trump administration, divisions sharpened. Some advisors urged quiet damage control, suggesting a statement of regret or even a recall of Hoekstra to ease tensions. But Trump bristled at the idea of backing down, convinced that projecting toughness was essential both to his brand and to his base. This refusal to apologize only deepened Canadian resentment, and Carney's prominence in the debate grew as he was invited onto panel after panel, his words dissected by analysts, his demeanor contrasted with the bluster emanating from Washington. Carney spoke not as a partisan, but as a voice of principle, emphasizing that respect between nations was the bedrock of cooperation, and that once eroded it was difficult to restore, and Canadians rallied behind him, seeing in his arguments a reflection of their own frustration. The fury turned cultural as Canadian musicians, actors, and writers weighed in, using their platforms to denounce the ambassador's remarks and to demand greater dignity in how their country was treated. Hashtags like #RespectCanada and #CarneySpeaks began trending, galvanizing a new generation of Canadians who perhaps for the first time felt compelled to defend their nation's honor against what they perceived as condescension from Washington. Meanwhile, U.S. officials stationed in Canada found themselves under increased scrutiny and pressure, their every move watched for signs of either contrition or continued arrogance. At diplomatic receptions long marked by camaraderie, conversations turned icy, and Canadian officials who once toasted partnership now pointedly reminded their American counterparts of the depth of public outrage. In this atmosphere, Carney's influence soared, not because he sought it, but because his reputation for integrity and intellect stood in stark contrast to the dismissive tone of the ambassador. His words, delivered without flourish but with conviction, reminded Canadians of the values they cherished and of the stakes involved in defending them. For Americans, his message carried another resonance: that arrogance abroad carried costs at home, costs measured in strained alliances, lost trade, and diminished respect on the world stage. This was the reality that unfolded in the weeks after Hoekstra's remarks, a reality where one man's dismissive words became a catalyst for national fury, diplomatic strain, and a reckoning about the meaning of respect between neighbors. As the controversy widened, Canadian fury evolved into something deeper, no longer just anger at Hoekstra's words, but a re-examination of the entire US-Canada relationship, with opinion polls showing a sharp decline in Canadian trust toward American leadership, numbers plunging to historic lows as citizens questioned whether their powerful neighbor still valued partnership or merely tolerated it, And Carney's role in this transformation cannot be overstated, because by framing the debate around respect, rather than just economics, he shifted the narrative from trade disputes and tariffs into one of dignity, sovereignty, and identity, striking chords that resonated across Canadian society. In universities, students debated the implications of a United States that saw Canada not as an equal, but as an appendage. And in workplaces, ordinary Canadians discussed whether their country should pivot more toward Europe or Asia for its future alliances. Canadian businesses, long intertwined with American supply chains, began exploring diversification strategies, hedging against the risk of further diplomatic deterioration, and these moves signaled that the impact of Hoekstra's remarks extended far beyond politics into the very fabric of economic planning. In the end, Hoekstra's words may fade from the headlines, but the scars they left on US-Canada relations will not vanish so easily. Carney's calm defiance revealed a truth larger than any single remark: that respect between nations is not a courtesy, it is the foundation of trust, and once that foundation cracks, the ripple effects spread far beyond borders. For Canada, this was a moment of unity. For America, it was a warning of how arrogance abroad can bring consequences at home. The question now is simple: will leaders learn from this fallout, or will history repeat itself with even greater costs? If you believe these stories matter, if you want to see more truth behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe to Traveling Vibes, because the fight for respect, dignity, and accountability is only just beginning.